Here to formally introduce our speaker is Vikram Prasad. Vikram is a third year from London, studying political science and public policy. He has served as a Fellows Ambassador, a member of our International Policy Program, and a summer intern for the IOP in Washington, D.C. Beyond the Institute, he is involved with the College Republicans and the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Please join me in welcoming Vikram to the podium.
Thank you, Gretchen. Good evening, everyone. It is my great honor to introduce our guest for this evening, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. Dr. Khalilzad is one of the most accomplished diplomats of our time and is world-renowned as an expert on foreign policy, particularly the Middle East and South Asia. He was born and raised in Afghanistan and earned his PhD in 1979 from none other than UChicago. After earning his PhD, he became a professor at Columbia's School of International Public Affairs and then moved on to senior roles in the State and Defense Departments under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. In 2003, President Bush appointed him as U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, where he helped draft the current constitution and rebuild the political system after the fall of the Taliban. He then became ambassador to Iraq in 2005, where he once again played a major role in the country's reconstruction and helped found the American University of Iraq, where he is on the board of trustees. After serving in Iraq, he was unanimously confirmed by the Senate as the ambassador to the UN and served in that post until 2009. Dr. Khalilzad has served as a counselor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most prominent think tanks in Washington, and now works in the private sector as the president of Griffon Partners, a strategic advisory firm focused on emerging markets. Moderating the discussion will be our very own Professor Robert Pape, professor of political science and director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. He is considered one of the world's foremost experts on strategic air power and terrorism studies. Now, without further ado, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad and Dr. Robert Pape.
Well, welcome, Ambassador. Welcome to you all. You all, I think you're in for a great night. We rarely have somebody as accomplished and as successful in so many different areas of American national security policy in front of us, and with such a great future ahead of him. Yeah. We haven't talked about some of those possibilities yet. And also a University of Chicago alum. I mean, how can we beat that? Yeah. So I would like to first start out with a question about U.S. leadership in the world. So Ambassador Khalilzad is really famous for being a proponent of U.S. power and leadership in the world, and particularly that U.S. power can be a force for stability. Now, anybody watching, President Trump's policies would wonder whether he agrees or not. Recently, President Trump has announced that he wants to pull out as rapidly as possible from Syria, removing U.S. power from a key area of the world. President Trump's policy of America First very famously called for the Europeans and Asian allies of the U.S. to do more and will do less. So one of my first questions is, as you look out over the Trump administration so far, do you think that President Trump fundamentally agrees that U.S. leadership and power is a force for good for the world and for the United States?
Well, first of all, it's a delight to be back at the University of Chicago. My years here had a huge impact on me. On my trajectory. Without the University of Chicago, if I had gone somewhere else, God knows what would have happened to me. But it's a pleasure to be here after very many years. Having said that, with regard to your question, I believe myself that U.S. global leadership is very important for stability and for positive evolution in the world, and for maintaining peace and stability, and for preventing particularly a global war. And what do I mean first by U.S. leadership? I was the head of policy planning at the Defense Department when the Cold War ended. And sometimes when you're a head of a policy planning or a member of a policy planning shop, if the world is going gone fine, there's nothing big going on. It's not a terribly interesting job to have because operationally the various departments and bureaus, and whether it's the State Department, Defense, doing the day-to-day things. But policy planning becomes an interesting place to be if there is a big change. So you have to do new thinking about what we should do, how to relate to the change that has taken place. And the US became the world's only superpower as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, because multipolarity of the 19th century gave way to bipolarity after World War II. And this bipolarity then ended with the end of the Soviet Union. So the argument that I made and the strategy that we came up with, which was embraced by some and denounced by others, I have to say, was that we ought to consolidate this kind of unipolarity, or as we call it, US global leadership, and seek to preclude the rise of global rivals, whether it's a bipolar system or a multipolar system, and that even if those one or the other was inevitable, it'll be best that we delay it for as long as possible, because in multipolarity led to two world wars. And bipolarity, although there was some degree of stability because of the nuclear revolution in part, perhaps, but there was risks of global war, including hugely catastrophic nuclear war. So, and so that was the prism, and continues to be in my mind the prism through which I look at the world, and through what becomes important, what becomes lesser important. If you replace the containment framework, which guided us between World War II largely and the end of the Cold War for the next period, that this concept, this objective, grand objective, should be the goal, and then the strategy and plans and policies, even day-to-day policies, have to be largely guided by that approach. And I believe, I'm sure you'll ask a lot of questions about it, but let me now jump from that perspective to the current administration, which has a slightly different perspective than that. On the one hand, America First policy as a slogan can be interpreted to mean the same thing as US leadership. It can be. I don't know that it necessarily is, because nobody in the United States would say we should aim for second or third or fourth. Right. So it's a no-brainer in a sense that America, it appeals to American psychic to be, we are first, or we should put America first as we do things, of course. It doesn't mean you don't do other things, but we should be. But in terms of actual policies, and this kind of degree of retrenchment and almost isolationism will create the circumstances, in my view, and that's where I differ, in which we precipitate, perhaps accelerate the rise of global rivals. And because if we don't play a role in assisting with security in critical regions, others would seek to provide that security inevitably, because there will be a demand for it.
Yeah.
And in providing that security, maybe there will be domination of those regions by powers that are rivals or hostile. And a critical region, in my judgment, I define it as a region that has enough capability, resources in it, that if a single power dominated it, it would have sufficient capability to be a global power, a global rival. So the overall framework of my thinking is like that, and I believe, I mean, there's always details we could argue about, but I would say that's where I think the risk of a kind of retrenched, withdrawn America, that at least during the campaign one heard from candidate Trump could lead to, if should he actually behave consistent with those slogans.
Yeah, so one thing you might like to know inside of this is I just came from class where I just taught the 1992 defense guidance.
Right.
So you're just quoting chapter and verse from that for those from my class. And
You're right.
But so part of the actual policy of the first Bush administration.
Well, for those of you who are interested in this particular issue, I have a lot in the book. I don't know whether some of you were in high school or maybe in elementary school. You're too young. But some people who are in high school, there was a debating card that that chapter or that idea was in the late 90s.
So I'd like to jump off from that answer. You're also well known as a practical man who solves practical problems. And we'll talk a bit about some of those constitutions in just a moment. But I want to talk about practical issues with implementing the grand strategy you just discussed today. Let's talk first about Russia.
Right.
So Russia, the Trump administration, and even before the Trump administration, there was talk about U.S. having a nuclear buildup because we want to be the strongest nuclear power in the world and not challenged in any way at the nuclear level.
Right.
What we're seeing with ballistic missile defense and what we're seeing with other nuclear capabilities we're developing is Putin, Russia, very nervous about their nuclear deterrent. And you're seeing a lot of bellicose language from Putin about this. And as you know from your studies with your great mentor, Albert Wohlstetter, one of the gods of nuclear deterrence theory, there's a lot of issues here. So Ambassador Khalilzad, can you help us understand what practically we can do to pursue that nuclear primacy and in the context of competition or cooperation with Russia? How do we think about Russia in particular in this regard?
I think of Russia in a slightly different way, which is that Russia is a declining power still, and economically its relative position in the world is declining. It's now, I think, number 12 or 13 economy in the world. Its economy is smaller than South Korea, smaller than Italy, smaller than Spain, but yet it's a power that's nostalgic about its greatness when it was one of the two powers, a power which regards itself as many countries do, special with a substantial military capability. And so the challenge in my view, from Russia is not one that it will become kind of in a comprehensive way a global rival, but rather that the challenge is that its decline mixed with its military power could produce behavior that would be risky for the rest of the world, for us too. That their risk calculation may be less prudent as a result than it should be. So our strategy, in my view, ought to be, based on the grand strategy that I described, how to manage that Russian decline prudently so that it doesn't lead to war. And that perhaps shows being sensitive to a degree. A lot of my friends might get or not happy when I say that, to be sensitive to Russian critical interest, of course, push back against, with regard to their interference in our elections, to defend ourselves, push back when they become aggressive against, in terms of allies and interests, but at the same time be prudent and show sensitivity. And I believe that Russia post-Putin was unique in many ways, would face tough choices because the system is going to be more of a bipolar system again if it evolves, and if current trends hold, will be China and us, probably as two powers. So Russian choices would be, does it join with us to balance, vis-a-vis China? Does it feel more threatened by China than by us? Chinese allies don't seem to be doing as well as American allies, so I would think I hope that they would join the West, but it probably won't. So it could be the leader of a non-aligned movement in a new bipolar system. That Russia wouldn't be strong enough, in my view, to be a third pole in a three kind of multipolar system of three, although EU potentially could be also one. So it may face one option that it would have, that it would lead a bunch of countries who may not want to join either China bandwagon with a rising China, or stay with the United States. So I see Russia as potentially a leader of a non-aligned movement down the road, and in a new bipolar system. Now, of course, to get from here to there,
So to talk just a little bit more about Russia, but to put in the context of Japan in the 1930s. So Japan in the 1930s was also in relative decline vis-a-vis the United States, and we decided to slap oil sanctions on Japan in the summer of '41, as you know, but then most of the audience may not know that's what led Yamamoto and a lot of Japanese to want to do Pearl Harbor.
So I say we have to be very prudent. We have to be very careful because it's a combustible combination, frankly, in Russia, of this decline, but yet a lot of military power, very unhappy with where they are.
So should we lift sanctions? Because right now we've put on sanctions on Russia. So should we do more to pull back missile defense? Should we lift sanctions?
I favor broadly, of course we could talk about very specific things, but I broadly favor, it may have to do something with my background as to where I was born and my own journey. But I think generally when I talk to kind of our leaders and policymakers, we tend to categorize countries, even other things, in terms of either or, kind of, you're a friend, you're an adversary. And I favor towards Russia a policy of what I would call congagement. Which has a combination of containment and engagement, not 50-50 necessarily. So I would be mixing and matching, and I'm sure a lot of smart students at the University of Chicago could have fun with this, and to see where you will to avoid the fate of what happened between us and Japan, to avoid the potential conflict between Russia. Where do you go, where do you emphasize engagement?
Yes, right.
And where do you push kind of containment and push back? And I'm sure there are various mixes and matches, and there may be one, as Albert Wohlstetter would say, would be the dominant one that could do well on a range of circumstances. But these, of course, it's a very complex issue. And again, talking about Albert, should be careful what we assume about.
Well, you had the pleasure of knowing it.
Yeah. So that's, I think I'll stay at that level at the present time, but we could go in more detail should you like.
So let me shift to U.S. leadership in a different part of the world,
Yeah.
one that you've had a whole lot of personal. I want to talk about the Middle East broadly defined, and especially the role of U.S. power in spreading democracy.
Right.
So Ambassador Khalilzad has been deeply involved in helping to establish new constitutions in Afghanistan, 2003 to 2005, also Iraq. So he was the critical, pivotal ambassador in both of these situations, or what we call the spread of democracy.
Right.
This is really right at the practical edge of what we mean. And these are big questions, so I'd like to ask a little bit about the history here, and then there's a lot of current questions related to this. But can we start a little bit with like your personal lessons learned that you yourself take? So when you look back at the two deep experiences you've had with trying to bring democracy to two really major countries, what do you look at as the lessons that we got right, that we didn't get right, that we would do differently, you would do differently in the same circumstances here? Before we start going to the future, just help us get what's inside your head when you think of your own personal experiences with spreading democracy in those two countries.
Well, first, broadly, I have to say I believe that among all the systems that we have available, democracy is the best. It may be has its own challenges, but it is the best. And we could discuss that for many hours. I serve on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy and believe very much in promoting prudently self-government and democratic political order. Now, as to experience, and also broadly, I believe that there are no huge category of people or races or religions that will never accept democracy because of their those characteristics. I know that I've learned at the University of Chicago that when there was discussions of self-government or democratic government in India during the British era, there are people who, the Rudolphs were professors here during my time. I don't know whether they are.
My advisors.
Okay, and India, with all its challenges, is a democracy, and to the surprise of those in London, they would not be, or even Germany or Japan. So the part of the world that I've had the fortune or misfortune of having to deal with is, I think, also could become democracy. If you look at Islam being a factor, which is, Islamic civilization is going through a crisis. We can talk about that, but I think, there are places in which democracy, with all its problems, that worked and has succeeded. Indonesia, it is the largest Muslim country in the world, is with all its troubles, is moving in the right direction. Turkey, for long periods of time, although with Erdogan, we don't know where it's heading. There have been others, smaller countries, that have had these experiences. Now, as to promote democracy, sometimes we have reduced it to two things: a constitution that is democratic, and an elections. But we know that democracy is a lot more than that, and in our approach, our public, our leaders, even the leaders that I served under, would say, get the Constitution and get an election going. Yes, those are important. I would say that, and we have to do it in a hurry, without really a true national compact, where the Constitution, where the concerns of all key groups have been dealt with, because we have had to meet a deadline. And so one lesson is, having a 2-month deadline for a constitution to be agreed to, is that a good idea? And if you do it in a hurry, some issues are dealt with in a way that the issue hasn't been really resolved. It has been papered over or left to be dealt with in subsequent laws that to be passed by Parliament. It may also, therefore, lead to a civil war because the issue can't be resolved or is not agreed to in a way that can avoid that. So you have to recognize that where you are in terms of the circumstances in the country, in terms of broad consensus whether there is on key issues, that takes a lot longer. Not that democracy is not possible, not that democracy shouldn't be seen as desirable, but that it will take time, that it will require nurturing, that it will require work on a multiple set of issues. And sometimes our approach sometimes they're in tension with each other. I'll give you one example of the tension. In Iraq, as you know, we spend a huge amount of resources. And we insisted on a constitution and we insisted on an election. But when the election did occur, there were various parties that were obviously competing, some religious, some secular, transcending sectarianism being a key factor in Iraq. And we have a lot of money coming across, although Iraq is a rich country, but nevertheless, money coming across to some parties from the neighboring countries, Iran, and some of the Arab countries. And you will be surprised that after repeated requests to me from the political leaders for resources of those secular, cross-sectarian or non-sectarian parties, we did not have $1 to assist those parties in their election, because we had passed a law. Of course, those of us who know the history of Europe, there was a period we supported a lot of parties against in Europe during the post-World War II period. But because of then the things that happened, some of them not so positive, we passed a law that we will not interfere in elections, and therefore we can't, we did not have money for elections unless the president did a finding which has to be briefed to several members of Congress, and the money came through the intelligence channels for those parties. And given the state of politics in Washington, and the extreme polarization, when a draft of such a finding was signed or was being signed, I think it hadn't been signed yet. Maybe it was. I'm not sure. By President Bush, it was leaked in the front page of the New York Times when the congressional leaders were briefed, so the program was withdrawn. So there is a lot of issues. You have rivals who don't want democracy. You have rivals in Iran, for example, in the case of Iraq, who have their own model of what is the appropriate model. You have even Arab allies who do not want democracy in Iraq to succeed. And you had the Democrats not having the resources to compete. One final thought, that if you don't get politics right, in my view, since we are at this institute, in those sort of settings, it creates security problems. And then you have to put a lot more resources, human and financial, to deal with the security consequences of not helped with the politics in a way that with far less resources and attention, you could have dealt with perhaps more successfully.
So as you know, I study terrorism.
Yeah.
So very concerned about terrorism as it's emerged in Iraq, for instance, and elsewhere. But before we went into Iraq in 2003, you could probably count on one hand the number of Islamic terrorists that were in the country, because Saddam had killed just about all of them.
Right.
And now it's hard to put them all in big cities because there's so many.
Right, sure.
Right? And so what I'm wondering is terrorism the price of spreading democracy, especially in the Middle East? And I wonder about that because what we've seen is, and you've been right at the cusp of it, what we've seen is areas like Sunni communities here where an effort to spread democracy has led to a lot of opportunity for terrorist leaders to take advantage of that. And I worry about it not just for the past and not just for Iraq today, but I worry about it because of possibilities of regime change or change of government or collapsed government in Iran. And I worry that efforts to spread democracy in Iran, it's important to get the lesson right. And so is a lesson that if we're going to spread democracy externally, we have to be prepared for terrorism.
Well, I would put it differently. It may be a consequence of democratization and early in its various stages in an environment in which that process is being used by external or internal forces to advance their interest that produces that. I'll illustrate that. If we had a true democracy in Iraq, let's say, or a more mature democracy, where the Sunni rights were respected, where it wasn't that the Shia who were oppressed for a very long time in Iraq, were the majority, felt that they should rule the Sunnis for a period. You know, they were ruled for 1,000 years, they would say, by the other side. And rather than bringing them in, if they had brought them in, and minority rights were also respected as rule of law and democracy would require, perhaps you wouldn't have the opportunity for extremism. Extremism grows, especially in this terrorist form, when there are extreme circumstances in which moderates cannot survive. You know, I started the dialogue when I was ambassador, when I came from Afghanistan to Iraq, with Sunnis. So much so that some of my Shia friends and colleagues used to call me the father of the Sunnis, because Abu Omar, those of you who may speak Arabic, and because I was in the Constitution, tried to consult them heavily, and they had a view, and I will tell this as might be of interest, because they believed that 9/11, which was carried out by Sunni Arabs, essentially. There was not a single Shia there. There were mostly Saudis.
Yeah, there were 15 Saudis on the 19. Yeah.
Right. That then the United States security establishment, the deep state, as they would, or as President Trump might say also, got together and said, how do we take revenge? This would be a very Middle Eastern thing, talk about revenge, as you would appreciate. How do we take revenge on the Sunnis? So we decided, the United States of America decided, that the best way to take revenge on the Sunnis is to take a country that's run by Sunnis, but it's majority Shia, and turn it over, give it, and that now the Shia are taking revenge on behalf of the United States along with us to kill Sunnis or oppress them. So, and I would say that's projection. That's what you would do. And many Americans wouldn't know, even in the policy circles at that time, maybe now they would. So but the extreme circumstances in the Sunni area created or helped create conditions for the rise of more extreme elements. I used to use that with Sunni leadership, that their lack of participation in the political process, they're fighting us, fighting the Iraqi forces, creates extreme circumstances in which their middle class will not survive, they will run away, education will suffer. In Reconstruction cannot take place, and only extremists will survive and thrive in that environment. So I would, for example, for Sunni extremism, I would blame some of our, in Iraq, some of our own mistakes too. I don't think our effort at democratization was not without its problems. I believe that shifting objectives in Iraq after the invasion, whatever you think about the invasion, whether it was wrong-headed or it was the right thing to do, and I have friends on both sides of that. But once we went there, we went with the idea of immediately turning over Iraq, as in the case of Afghanistan, to an Iraqi government. Instead, what we did was to say, we will govern Iraq ourselves and appoint someone as the ruler, essentially, of Iraq, my friend, Ambassador Bremer. And Ambassador Bremer then in turn goes and dissolves the army of Iraq, 400,000 to 500,000 people who know how to use arms, who are people with influence and respect in their communities. They're sent home. We didn't pay them their salaries for a long time. That was not, in my judgment, a smart decision. So, and Iran wanting, for example, with ties to the Shia, wanting the Shia to make sure that the Sunnis never can raise their head again in Iraq, for revenge for the Iranian war that the Sunni led in their view, which obviously Saddam's war against Iran was very costly for the Iranians. So all of those kind of issues created a set of circumstances in which these people grew. Yeah. And now we see in Syria, I do not believe that we see the end of Islamic extremism or terror in Syria, although ISIS may be done, given the circumstances.
Yeah, I wish I could have less business. Right. So I'd like to ask, probably it'll end up being for me just one more question, and then we're going to go to the audience. U.S. leadership it does connect to areas of the world, but about use of force.
Right.
So with the change of administration officials that we've just witnessed, right. Mike Pompeo coming in as our next Secretary of State, right. John Bolton already our new National Security Advisor. Right. Both of these individuals are known for tough stances right. against North Korea and right. Iran. Right. Bolton has published as recently as just a few months ago that preemptive, and he means really preventive, but preemptive war against North Korea is fully justified. Right. And I'd like to just ask your views about how you think about the conditions for the use of force, and especially preemptive and preventive use of force. Do you think those conditions, whatever you think they are likely to materialize, as you would define the proper conditions, over, say, the next year or so? Because right. with these two individuals here, this could well be a live discussion.
Right. Well, on North Korea, of course, the issue really is whether we are going to accept, or we should accept, and we need a national debate on this, and that it should acquire, as it is on the path to doing so, a capability to strike the United States with nuclear weapons. To have not only the weapons, which they do have, but the delivery system that can target American cities. And if we accept that, what are the consequences? If we acquiesce to it, what are the consequences? Some would say we can deter them, as we have deterred other nuclear powers with this Albert Wolfson's second strike
That's right.
capability. And some say that will be easy, some say it will be difficult. We have had great professors arguing on both sides of that once you get nuclear weapons, even Hitler would have been self-deterred because the use would have led to total destruction. Like if you have a
And the nuclear
balance
world
of-
is in part due to Chicago.
Right,
University of
exactly. So, but then others would argue that that not only there is it's a risk that's unacceptable that we can preclude it, but what price is what we're arguing about, but that it would have implications for deterrence and strategy and presence and alliances in Asia. With Japan, and we had these debates during the Cold War about Europeans, and some of them decided to go nuclear themselves because they couldn't trust the United States to put New York at risk for the sake of Paris, and that's why the French nuclear force de frappe was developed. So that Japan may say, well, would the United States risk New York for Tokyo, and what the implication of a Japan nuclearization would be. It isn't going to be a small nuclearization program, the assumption is. What would that mean for South-North relations on the Korean Peninsula if that happens? Would they seek to, would the North be more aggressive at levels below nuclear to push the North, thinking its survival is not at risk, that the nuclear capability protects that? So if you put all of that, do you threaten war or perhaps the use of force before they acquire that ability to hit, with the expectation, it could be a miscalculation, that could bring them to the table? Mm-hmm. And if you talk to President Trump, I'm sure he believes that his bellicose language, his threat of the potential for war, maybe premature to celebrate, may have led to this reconsideration and perhaps the summit where the North is agreeing that denuclearization is on the table. Unfortunately, this has been on the table before too, and it hasn't happened. So we will have to see. So I think that this issue of Korean nuclearization is a big issue, and it could be could have if it's not handled right, it could be transformative in terms of that region. So therefore, I think a deliberate strategy that doesn't take the option of attack against nuclear facilities potentially off the table, for now at least, is the right approach.
But let me just ask one more kind
Yeah.
of further extension on North Korea, which
Right.
is, let's move from coercive bargaining to the threshold of actually striking North Korea.
Right.
And especially regime change,
Right.
which would, if we do strikes, will be a lot of pressure to
Right.
topple the regime.
Right.
One of the things I worry about is a loose nuke problem.
Right.
So with Iraq, we topple a regime, we talk about spreading democracy.
Right.
There's uneasy issues with terrorism.
Right.
With North Korea, we have all those issues, but we have one other issue,
Right.
which is 13 to 60 nuclear weapons, and we don't
Right.
even know how many.
Right.
Right? And so if that happens, then we have one of these unbelievable scrambles to try to get all those loose nukes,
Sure.
and we don't even know how many there are to get.
Right.
So are you concerned about
I
this?
am. I would be. I would rather not pursue a regime change through attacks, but in an evolutionary way would be better. And you know, there's you've put your finger on some of the complexities. You may have a good plan.
Right.
But what I learned again from Albert was when plan meets reality, you know, things never work exactly according to plan.
Yeah.
And you've got to question your assumption if you're assuming that the plan will succeed. I mean, I've experienced myself many things, and even as students, I think one should question when one gets into the discussion the assumptions that inform that. And I'll give you a quick example from my experience of how assumption can lead you the wrong way.
Yeah.
Although it would seem at the time that you're assuming that thing, it would seem not a problem. It makes sense, that assumption. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, when I first joined the government on a Council on Foreign Relations Fellowship, when I began to look at classified stuff and get involved with the different agencies, the assumption was that the Soviet Union would prevail in Afghanistan. I thought that was not an unreasonable assumption, given the size of Afghanistan, the size of the Soviet Union, given the Brezhnev doctrine. And some of you may have not been born when these things were big issues, where once a country on the border of the Soviet Union became socialistic or Marxist-Leninist, joined the Soviet bloc, it was a one-way highway, so to speak. Getting out was not an option. And the history of how Soviets used force, that they would use the force necessary to prevail. So that assumption, which was reasonable, I mean, I would have thought was reasonable, led to a policy that they said, how do we increase the cost of that victory for the Soviets? And therefore, we didn't think about the post-Soviet Afghanistan. Therefore, we gave assistance and weapons to anyone and everyone who wanted to go there and fight, including some undesirable elements who later on became headaches for ourselves.
That's right.
But imagine if somebody had argued, wow, wait a minute, what if they withdraw? I mean, all these kind of other scenarios and contingencies. Again, Albert's contribution, you have to think about that, contingencies, alternatives, the whole issue of alternative future studies has emerged because this saying, here's the plan, here is what's going to happen, here what we're going to do can get you in some difficulty. There are people who still may think what we did in Afghanistan was the right thing to do, because even with terrorism as a byproduct, the end of the Soviet Union, which Afghanistan may have contributed to, was worth the price. But that leads you to another debate where, how important was Afghanistan in the demise of the Soviet Union and so forth. So,
I think it's been great, and I've been monopolizing this for a long time, so I think what we should do is turn it over to the audience to ask questions. And as you can see, wide-ranging man here. Would it be fun to go have dinner with the ambassador?
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Well, Mr. Khalilzad, thank you for the speech again. I'm from Turkey.
Oh, you are. Marhaba.
Marhaba. As someone who also witnessed the Iraqi Kurdish leader Masoud Barzani's election in 2005.
Right.
I want to ask a question about the future of the Kurdish people. My main question is, when you think the democratic demands and the democracy Kurdish people establish, both within their inner circles in Turkey or within their democratic demands in Iran, or like the autonomous Iraqi Kurdistan in general, will be respected globally? My rationale of the question is, we've seen the Iraqi independence Kurdistan, the independence referendum for the Iraqi Kurdistan not being taken seriously by major democratic powers, although we've seen that it proved to be one of the most democratic establishments so far in the region in terms of stability and the respect and human rights and the minorities. What you think is the price of democracy for the Kurdish people? What should they do, or what's the future for them?
Well, I believe, I could answer it in two ways. One would be to describe the complexities, but you probably don't want that. You know it probably better than I do. My sense is that the Kurds, especially the Kurds of Iraq that I know relatively well, they do not want to be part of Iraq. They believe that the Arabs, whether Shia or Sunni, want to dominate Iraq. They are fighting each other for domination, and they certainly will not allow the Kurds to have their fair share, that they are part of Iraq because of decisions having to do with post-Ottoman colonial powers agreement between France and Britain. And I used to tease my British colleagues always that the American task has become to go around the world and clean up the messes they left behind. But I think the Kurds want to be separate, to have their own country, their own independence. Maybe they will be happy or not happy, but perhaps tolerate a kind of confederal arrangement in which they essentially run everything they do. They were close to it in Iraq under the Constitution and for the last many years. But then they felt that Prime Minister Maliki became more aggressive as Iraq, the institutions got stronger, the army was built up. So I think eventually, if I had to predict, Kurdistan will become an independent state. It's not a question of whether, but when, and under what circumstances. And I think the United States advised the Kurds in the recent referendum, as you know, that's why we recognized that their aspiration, and we thought it eventually would happen. They were not quite ready, and the circumstances weren't quite ready. But the Kurds have, in response, always have said, "You always tell us that. We have been hearing that for a decade. When will the time be right? How many countries have emerged at the right time, so to speak?" But I believe the aspirations are there, very strongly felt. And if other dominant ethnic groups do not deal with them fairly within other countries through federalism or confederal arrangement, the threat to disintegration of those countries will be there and may grow even.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming here and speaking with
Pleasure.
us today. First, I'd like to preface my question by saying that I recognize the duplicity played by the Pakistani army and how damaging that is to the Pakistan and Afghanistan relationship. I also recognize that great affliction has been imposed by both sides.
Right.
That being said, it's been nearly 40 years of increasing conflict. What do you think Pakistan needs to do to finally move past this? And
Sure.
also, what does Afghanistan need to do the same?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. I have argued since I was sent to Afghanistan, although when President Bush asked me to become ambassador to Afghanistan, I said, "Remember, I left there. What did I do that you're shipping me out," so to speak. But in any case, I ended up really feeling good about what we were doing there. Only in America could something like this happen. But one of the things that I saw from the get-go was that unless we get the Afghan-Pakistan relationship to a situation that Pakistan is not a problem for stabilizing Afghanistan, it will take us a long time to stabilize Afghanistan, because Afghanistan didn't have much of anything when we got there. It already had been fighting for 30 years or so since the Soviet invasion. And the country was devastated. The entire banking system of a country of 30 million had $170 million.
Wow.
Of course, the University of Chicago, we know, is worth a lot more. So I'm just telling you, you can see what I'm talking about.
For sure.
30 million people.
Yeah, no,
Yeah. So, and no institutions like an army of its own and so forth. So to build this country to defend itself against a much stronger neighbor, Pakistan, a country of 200 million with a strong army and so forth. And unfortunately, Pakistan has not been helpful. It has provided sanctuary to the Taliban that have been fighting in Afghanistan. So still, that objective remains valid, that unless you get this thing resolved, now Afghanistan is in a better position than it was 16 years ago to defend itself. We had 100,000 plus troops. Now we are at 15,000, even with the increase that Trump has ordered. But, you know, the Afghans are doing what 85,000 additional American troops used to do. But they still have a long way to go. So what I would like to see, ideally, is an agreement between Afghanistan and Pakistan that Afghanistan will not be a base for anti-Pakistani kind of activities, where groups that don't like Pakistan can operate from, and the same on the other side. And then there is, you know, Afghanistan's future and Pakistan's future in part depends on trade, and then Afghanistan be a kind of land bridge between Central Asia and South Asia, and especially India and Pakistan too, but India's economy is growing. There's a lot of demand, and there are a lot of natural resources in Central Asia, oil, gas, and that could be brought there, and Afghanistan as a transit country could benefit from. So, but they have not been able to achieve that, and now Pakistan is under a lot of U.S. and international pressure to change course in a way that was not the case earlier. So we'll see. There are some positive signs. I'm encouraged by them, and now Pakistan itself is going through these changes. I don't know, you see the Pashtun movement and others. So, but that's a key reason. And I will keep pushing President Bush to appoint someone to work on this Afghan-Pakistan relations. And I was happy to see President Obama appoint someone, and Ambassador Holbrooke, to that task. Unfortunately, he died before he could achieve something. But that requires a lot of hard diplomacy, maybe bilateral or multilateral, to get a settlement of the issues between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Yang. I'm the second year PhD in sociology. So image matters for Kim Jong-un, and unfortunately for him, he was depicted by media as a cartoonish little rocket man. But his visit to China a few weeks ago actually improved his image a lot.
Right.
Lots of people did talk about he's a rational actor or a very smart actor, and many people talk about his wife dressed beautifully and was a beautiful lady. So his image improved a lot. So my question is, how should Trump administration manage this image improving opportunity for Kim Jong-un to bargain for some sort of denuclearization talk? What would be the strategy, even though the Trump administration, the self-image problem is not easy to manage as well?
Of course, language was used by both sides that was unusual in interstate relations. I'm saying that the North Korean leader also called, you know, may not bother us as much because a lot of people call our president here all kinds of names, regardless of who the president is.
That's right.
But this was
names, different president.
it was a mutual thing. I think if you want diplomacy to work, you shouldn't corner leaders. You shouldn't challenge their manhood, so to speak. It may differ from culture to culture, but if you have made it about the leader and in a way that if he compromises, it undermines him at home, given what you have said. He's not going to do that. And so it depends what you want. If you want a war, but you can shape the dialogue, especially public diplomacy, in a way that he cannot agree with you. So you can always say you're interested in diplomacy, but yet you say things in the process that makes it impossible, and you're ready to hit him, so to speak, and he can give you the opportunity to do that. So I would be, I mean, you're making a smart point that, and that maybe as we're, in this case, I think we don't want a war for its own sake. And given all the risks that everyone knows. So therefore, taking this factor that you're pointing into account is very important. And I appreciate the point that you've raised.
I had somewhat mixed feelings about Kim Jong-un's visit to China, in that one could imagine Xi Jinping offering a system that you could engage in the same kind of reform and opening up that we did, but we can preserve autocracy.
Right.
And so I can see a system, and Putin, Erdogan, Xi Jinping, and others may be allies in bringing this about, of what one could call a world that's safe for autocracy.
Right.
But against this, one can see that Putin's situation in Russia even is rather precarious, that exposing, if the person who was attacking corruption had been allowed to run, he might have even brought a big... So can one see a kind of new Cold War very much based on promoting some kind of rule of law, liberal democracy, versus promoting some kind of autocracy connected with global financial inducements and corruption and so on? And what should, I'll say, a post-Trump administration do to use the what I would call a kind of providential reaction against corruption and against being lied to? That those I can see as two very energetic forces to attack the system safe for autocracy.
Right. Well, I mean, as a general principle, we ought to be prudently, not in a cookie-cutter approach, but prudently standing for our values and promoting rule of law, promoting anti-corruption efforts, supporting civil society, supporting democratic forces, nurturing them. But I wouldn't go to use of force against North Korea or certainly against Russia for promotion of democracy as such, because of the kind of risks associated with that. Of course, we ultimately would want democracy spread to Russia and democracy spread to North Korea, but that has to be done with regard to those countries in an evolutionary way. Now, if because of other factors we get into a conflict with North Korea or with another country, well, that changes the equation. But people say, well, we went to Iraq to promote democracy, or we went to Afghanistan to promote democracy. That's not obviously correct. We would never have gone to Afghanistan if 9/11 hadn't occurred. That's right. We went to Afghanistan with the objective to go after the people who were there, who planned the attack 9/11. And then we said we will never allow Afghanistan, or we wouldn't allow Afghanistan once again to become a place from which such an attack could take place. And then what do we do to avoid that? Is we got into this discussion. We don't want to occupy them forever to avoid such an outcome. So let's help Afghanistan build its institutions, have the resources in terms of institutions to control its own territory, so it wouldn't allow international terrorists to come there. And in Iraq, similarly, we didn't go there because we thought we need to have to build democracy there, although that's what it became later on. Our discussion of our objective, it was to get rid of Saddam Hussein because we believed that secretly had WMD, and I don't accept that President Bush knew that they didn't have WMD and just was looking for an excuse to go to war. So that would be my sort of, I don't want to make the world safe for autocracies, sure, but I don't want to, I wouldn't risk war with nuclear powers for the sake of promoting democracy. I would promote democracy in an evolutionary way in that situation. I don't know whether I've been responsive.
But very clear. Very clear. It was very clear. It's really good.
No, but whether the question, I understood the question right.
Yeah, non-war methods.
Yeah.
Ambassador Khalilzad.
Sir.
Sorry?
I said, sir.
Yeah.
Paying my respect, yes.
Thank you. In your discussion, you've mentioned how you basically mentioned the importance of, in a way, developing democracy organically. However, one of the key issues with the post-invasion Afghanistan and post-invasion Iraq was a lack of success when it came to reconstruction. And in your view, what could the United States and its partners have done better in order to ensure a more successful and more secure post-invasion Afghanistan and Iraq?
Thank you. Well, great question. I would say that first, on a positive side, that Afghanistan is a much different and better place than it was before America got to Afghanistan. On average, Afghans live 11 years longer now than they did 17 years ago. Life for girls and women is dramatically better than it was under the Taliban. You know, I started the American University of Afghanistan when I was representing the United States there. 40% are Afghan women. There are 25% of Afghan members of parliament are women. There are women entrepreneurs. I mean, I'm not trying to create an image as if they've achieved great success. You know, there are no serious problems. There are serious problems, but in terms of level of economic development, they have more than tripled their GNP per capita. I mean, the construction, the traffic problems. I mean, it's a. When I landed there in January of 2002, Kabul was like a dead city. Only you could see bicycles, and it was. And it's now has all the problems. You know, there is internet or cell phone coverage. 78% of Afghanistan. You know, I mean, it's a fundamentally a different place. But on the other hand, your question is, could we have done better? Yes, we could have done better. I believe that our institutions, particularly that deal with economic issues, development issues, must be reformed if we are going to stay in this business. The greatest frustration I had, both Iraq and Afghanistan, where we, during my period, at least we had a big role. We had lots of troops, and you know, we had just won, and a lot of resources. So when I asked my team, the economic team, on the political track, I had a plan with timelines of what I needed to do. Give me what do I need to do on the economic front to get this country to stand on its feet. What do I do first, right? And what do I do second and third? And what should I sequence it? Our people, our institutions that deal with reconstruction have largely become contract managers. They don't have the policy expertise, the theory. What's our theory? I used to ask them about economic development.
That's so Chicago.
Right. And so it would be frustrating. We would respond to demands, to requests. We need more schools. Okay, we will build schools. We need clinics. Okay, we'll build clinics. We need roads. Let's build roads. But why should I be building, there's a lot of needs, the humanitarian need, that's one thing. But well, development-wise, should laws come first? Should infrastructure? What kind of infrastructure? I used to then try to read a lot, Lee Kuan Yew and others, to see if I could learn something from them. But by the time you learn and you get the institutions that we have are resistant to things that you learn from a Lee Kuan Yew. So I would think we need a fundamental reform of our USAID and the State Department. I believe USAID is very good at providing humanitarian support. We save lots of lives, but when it comes to how do you do free market economic development, which would be a Chicago kind of, our institutions are not the same as they were in the 50s when we did the Marshall Plan after World War II, and we helped Korea later on, we helped Japan and others. So this is an area where I think some original thinking from the University of Chicago, this new class, would be extremely helpful.
Well, this is a great way to end, Ambassador Khalilzad, because what you're really doing all the way through tonight is showing us how ideas really matter in decisions in the world. Not just management, not just power, but actually ideas. So what you're seeing in all the answers to the questions by somebody who's actually driving a lot of decisions in the world is the power of ideas. And that is what we associate a lot with Chicago and say economics, maybe in physics, but also in international relations. And I think that you've been a great exemplar for that. And thank you for sharing your ideas for running the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic.
Thank you.
That
Great.
was fantastic.